As Elizabeth I approached the end of her life, the constant topic of conversation was who would be her successor. Her ministers all had their own opinions, often varying, while Elizabeth herself never truly confirmed who her own preferred candidate was. But in the end, it was the Scottish king, King James VI, who was selected to follow in her footsteps. So how did this come about? To discuss this very subject, I'm pleased to welcome historian Leanda de Lisle back onto the podcast for a discussion based around her book, After Elizabeth, The Death of Elizabeth and the Coming of King James. From those final few months of Elizabeth's life to the journey James made through England, join Leanda and I as we examine the moment when the Tudor dynasty reached its conclusion. Welcome back to the Tudor Chest podcast, episode 109, After Elizabeth, The Death of Elizabeth and the Coming of King James, with Leanda de Lisle. Welcome to the Tudor Chest podcast, Leanda de Lisle. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. Glad to be on.
Oh, thank you for coming back. You're here for the second time, and you're here to talk about actually a book that you wrote quite some time ago now, but more predominantly, I suppose, the story therein, which is After Elizabeth, The Death of Elizabeth and the Coming of King James. Before we get into that discussion specifically, I have a few questions for people to get to know you a bit better. So could you provide me with a short introduction into your background and what it is that you do full time?
Right, okay. Well, I am a writer. I've been a writer since I was a sort of teenager, really. I mean, I read history at university, but even during my university holidays, I did some sort of journalism and things, as well as the normal student jobs, working in shops and all that. I mean, millions of things I did. Yes, I went into journalism when I left university, became a columnist for Spectator, The Guardian, Country Life, weekly columns for all of them. And then I decided to go back to write history. And in fact, After Elizabeth was my first book. It was my first book. I thought it was fascinating that people assumed that, Elizabeth had died and then, James had become king and that's what everyone expected. When in fact it had been a real drama and nobody had known until the last minute who Elizabeth's heir was going to be. And so you might say it's a sort of drama about the succession and what was behind it.
It was they were an inherently dramatic family, weren't they? And I think that's the thing about, even now, I think one of the big reasons why we're so perpetually fascinated by the Tudors is these moments in history where things could have gone a completely different way had Arbella Stewart, for example, had much more backing. It's those little moments that we sort of overlook quite often, I think.
Yes, no, that's true. And the whole story of the Tudor succession is really the most, I suppose, fascinating part of the Tudor period. I wrote another book called Tudor, in English it's called Tudor, The Family Story. And it's because it is such a sort of family drama, really, as well as a part of the sort of shaping of our nation.
Exactly. And based on today's conversation, there's a couple of sort of more fanciful questions, really. But if you had the opportunity to jump in a time travel machine and witness a sort of a single moment from the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, do you have one?
I think I would like to witness the coronation. It was an extraordinary event. And Elizabeth played an extraordinary role in it, in the way that she greeted the people. She very much believed that her life and her throne she owed to the ordinary people of England and not to the nobility, for example, who had supported Jane Grey during the crisis after her brother Edward VI had died. So I would have loved to have seen that. There was, of course, the religious service the mass, or was it a mass? This was the great question at the time, what way she was going to go religiously. And I think I'd also
Yeah.
like to say it because the coronation is something which we still have. We've recently, with the death of Elizabeth II and the accession of King Charles, we've recently had a coronation. And a lot of the ceremony, is very similar to the ceremony we had then. It's different though, and I'd love to see that. It's sort of living history, really. And maybe she had bits that would be fantastic to revive when eventually we have another coronation.
And I think because it happened in Westminster Abbey, where the coronation of Elizabeth II and Charles III took place, there's also that just inherent continuity. So it would be fascinating to also see what did the Abbey actually look like at that point as well. Because as much as, yes, of course, there's a lot Elizabeth would recognise, I'm sure there's a lot she wouldn't. So that would also be quite interesting, wouldn't it?
No, absolutely. And of course, because it was just her coronation took place at the death of Mary the First, you would have still had, it would still have been a Catholic cathedral with all the Catholic statues and so forth. And I think that would have been, yes, that would have been very interesting. It was before the sort of the Protestant changes. So yes, it would have been looking backwards and forwards. So I think that's the moment I would have chosen.
And if you had the opportunity to ask King James VI / King James I a single question, what would it be?
Well, I'm not sure he'd tell me the truth, but I would say to him, so what was that all about, the Gowrie conspiracy? What happened there, James? Many of your listeners won't know what I'm talking about, the Gowrie conspiracy, but it was this extraordinary event when James had been out hunting and he stopped off at this sort of castle belonging to his friends, the Riven brothers. One was the Earl of Gowrie, and the other one was his younger brother, Alexander. And he was alone with Alexander when there was suddenly a sort of terrible scream, and he sort of said, "Help, help," or whatever. And the men with him came and they killed Alexander, and then they killed the Earl of Gowrie, the elder brother. And James said they were attempting to kidnap him. But was something else going on? Was there some kind of sexual liaison? We don't really know. And what was the plot, and whose plot was it? Was it James's plot? Was he determined to kill them because they were allied to the Kirk with whom he was quarreling? Anyway, it's a mystery. It's a mystery moment in his reign, a murder mystery moment. They were tried. These two brothers were tried, although already dead, and their corpses were executed. Actually, on the day, as far as I remember, on the day that Charles I was born. But yeah. So So I think I would ask him about the Gowrie conspiracy and see if he told me the truth. Now he's dead. He might.
Yeah, that's so sort of coincidental, though, isn't it? Because obviously, famously, Charles II orders the remains of Oliver Cromwell and the other sort of key parliamentarians involved in his father's execution to be dug up and re-executed and strung up. There's a huge sort of circle there, isn't there?
Absolutely. And funny enough, my biography of Charles I, White King, I do bookend his life with exactly those scenes. The beginning, you have I think I open with pretty much with the execution. Certainly it appears very early in my book, the execution of the Gowrie brothers, the Riven brothers. And at the end, as you say, there's the digging up of the body of Cromwell and others and their execution. Yeah, quite grim stuff, isn't it? Rotting,
very much.
Corpses. From their perspective, better dead than alive, though, I think, to be drawn and quartered.
Yes, it definitely wouldn't have hurt as much.
No, exactly.
So, as I said at the start, we're here to talk about really the story that your first book is all about, the death of Elizabeth and the coming of King James, the first Stuart monarch, and the first monarch of both England and Scotland. The book starts with Sir John Harington arriving at Whitehall Palace for Christmas in 1602. Now, what sort of mood / political landscape, what sort of environment was Harington walking into?
Well, Harrington, first of all, was a great character. He was Elizabeth's godson, and he's, a great writer, and he's very funny and very astute. So he's a wonderful witness, you might say, and he gives a very vivid description. So you really feel that you're there with him when he arrives, and he goes to see his godmother, and it's clear that she's extremely ill, and she's very sort of depressed, and she's sort of weeping over the treachery that's been going on in Ireland, and the loss of her favourite, the Earl of Essex, who she had executed in 1601 from memory. And she still hasn't got over that, and she feels she's sort of losing the love of her people. While around her, people are sort of gambling, they're kind of enjoying themselves, they're young, they're looking to the future. So you have this kind of image of this weeping, dying old lady, and the sort of slight cruelty of the young in the way. But also, there's also a feeling of fear. I mean, it's a bit like, sort of England almost on the sort of cusp of the First World War or something, because people don't know what's coming, and they are fearful. They don't know what's coming when Elizabeth's going to die, because she hasn't named an heir. And it's very confusing, because under the terms of the last act of succession, and so written into English law, James's claim is, way down the list of candidates. And he's foreign and Scots, and so people don't like that. The Scots are a traditional enemy. And so they wonder, who's going to be king or queen? Are we going to be invaded again by Spain? They have a candidate in the Netherlands who has a rather better claim, many might argue, than James, and for a host of reasons. And yes, and so I think the atmosphere is febrile, you might say.
And he arrives carrying a tract that he has penned of his own accord, highlighting his preferred candidate to succeed Elizabeth, and that is King James VI of Scotland. So why does he favour James?
Yes, wise choice, really, since he was going to win. He is, by this stage, to be honest, the strongest choice, because he's backed by Robert Cecil, who is the most sort of powerful person in England under the Queen. This wasn't the case before the death of the Earl of Essex, her favourite, so things would have been a lot trickier if Elizabeth had died a couple of years earlier, because Robert Cecil, Essex was backing James, so Robert Cecil was back looking desperately for other candidates, and was looking at sort of possibly Bella Stuart, or one of the, and one of the descendant of one of the Grey sisters, Lady Jane Grey's younger sister Catherine, to be precise. And things would have been a bit trickier, but I think, Robert Cecil backed James. He seemed to be a moderate Protestant. I mean, so Harrington, very unusually for the time, was a genuine moderate. He didn't like, and as he actually wrote, he did not like the persecution, the very savage Elizabethan persecution of Catholics, which was spearheaded by the Cecils. He actually wrote in his tract that he didn't think, it was a very good argument where racks, i.e. the torture equipment, where racks serve for reasons, i.e., you've got to be a Protestant, because if you're not a Protestant, we're going to torture you and kill you, and punish you. And so he said, it wasn't great, force people racks serve for reasons. Yeah. And he believed, wrongly as it turned out, that James felt the same way. James's mother was, of course, Mary, Queen of Scots, the Catholic Queen of Scotland, while James himself was a Protestant. Came from, Presbyterian kingdom, very what we would call low church, which appealed to the Puritans in England. Although James himself was, as they would discover, was rather less Puritan than the Puritans had hoped. So he was seen as something, Harrington certainly saw him as a moderate who would stop the persecution of Catholics while being a Protestant himself.
And in his tract, he comments on the ever-growing unpopularity by this stage, of Elizabeth's government. So what is it that he's referring to here? How had Elizabeth's government become disliked?
Well, I think part of it is if you can imagine having the same prime minister for sort of 40 years, do you know, one would get a bit fed up. So a part of it was that people liked the stability, but you had this old woman by the 1590s. She was old, she didn't have any children. People wanted a guarantee for the future. They felt there was an inherent instability in the Elizabethan regime because she didn't have an heir, and they disliked that. Not actually Elizabeth's fault, but of course, if you're queen, you carry the can. She had been forced, really pressed into war with Spain, which was very expensive. So England was impoverished by war, by high taxation. There was a lot of corruption. To some extent, she was sort of losing control because she'd always been in a sort of quite a weak position. Also, when it came to matters of religion. Interestingly, I think, Elizabeth did a lot to shape the Church of England and the way the Church of England is even today. A huge amount, really. I mean, but I think because that is true, we overlook again how weak she was in religious matters. I mean, she was not her father, Henry VIII, and she was not the man who became her heir, i.e. King James. And there were things that she could not get away with. And what she could not get away with was imposing her will in the way they did on the Church of England. And so she could put her foot down and sort of block the more Calvinist changes that her own backers, people like William Cecil, who changed his mind eventually, but like William Cecil and people like him wanted when she became queen, and they wanted a more Calvinist Church of England than they got. So she managed to sort of not do things. She was great at not doing things.
She could often be quite contrary as well, which didn't help.
Yes, so she could be quite contrarian, and I think she's saved the English elite from themselves in a way because she didn't want sort of sudden extreme religious change, which I'm sure most people in England didn't want. But the problem was that by the end of her reign, the Church of England was at a very low ebb. They had their ministers, because they weren't priests. Their ministers were often poorly educated. People didn't really know what their own religion was, what Protestantism really was. They didn't understand that you weren't allowed to have crosses on graves and all sorts of things like that. They were very confused. So certainly the Puritans, who were the most energetic when it came to matters of religion, would be pleased to see the back of her. A lot of Catholics would be pleased to see the back of her because they'd been busy being hung, drawn, and quartered. So she wasn't particularly popular with them. A lot of young men at court, simple misogyny, really, and ageism, you might say. So there were a host of reasons why she wasn't beloved everywhere.
Yeah, and it's that, I suppose it's just that classic thing, isn't it, of one always looking to the rising rather than the setting sun. And because, to your point, she's been on the throne for 45 years. We've got her sister 5 years on the throne as well. So we've got effectively half a century of female rule, which is in itself viewed with great suspicion. So you can, as much as we struggle to understand it today, I suppose, for the young nobleman, there would have been certainly, I think, a huge amount of respect there, but also that kind of desire for fresh blood and, whether we like it or not, male blood controlling ththings.
Absolutely. And in time of war, it was particularly difficult to be a queen. Again, the sort of the lack of if you were a king, there was you were sort of praised if battles were won and so forth. But if you were a queen, you didn't get that in quite the same way. There was just a sort of it just you couldn't win really.
Yeah.
So yes, I think that's right. So people will like the idea of certainly of James being a man. Again, though, I think one has to remember, although James was a man which they looked forward to, and a man with a wife and children, which they looked forward to as well. His big downside was that he was Scottish.
And it's a difficult one to say, but to the best of our ability, is there a point during Elizabeth's reign where her council seemed to just accept the fact that she is not going to produce an heir of her own and that her successor would have to be a royal relation?
Well, they stopped trying to sort of marry her off with a view to actually have children as opposed to a diplomatic marriage. When the phrase was coined about her being a sort of virgin queen, they sort of accepted that. They did have for a very long time this kind of sword of Damocles hanging over their heads. And that was one reason why, of course, they were so anxious to destroy Mary, Queen of Scots. I mean, not least because Elizabeth, and this is one thing we don't know about, people don't think about or realize about Elizabeth. They think of Elizabeth as this great sort of goddess of English Protestant nationalism. And one of the reasons I found writing this book so fascinating was that England had an English Protestant heir. Her cousin, Catherine Grey, who married Edward Seymour, Earl of Hertford, son of the godly Duke of Somerset. So an ideal candidate to be a Protestant king of England. And there she would have been the sort of ideal queen. She produced two sons. Elizabeth destroyed her, imprisoned her, bastardized her children, which of course made Mary, Queen of Scots, the Catholic Queen of Scots, a much stronger candidate. Because she was the senior heir in blood, although, as I said, very important. And I think the other thing which is very important to remember is that Parliament had for a very long time been extremely important in the English succession. Henry VII had no right to the throne, essentially. And people think, but he married Elizabeth of York. That gave him a right. No, it didn't give him any right at all. And of course, she could have died. Her children could have died. And then what? His was the right of battle, but also Parliament, Act of Parliament, made him king. In the case of Mary and certainly particularly Elizabeth, who was illegitimate, Mary had her illegitimacy, which was proclaimed by Act of Parliament during Henry's reign. She had that reversed. Elizabeth was in a much more difficult position and remained illegitimate in law until the day she died. So she was only queen by right of Parliament, which is interesting. And Catherine Grey would have been queen by right of Parliament. But anyway, so that's why Elizabeth saw her as the greater threat and destroyed her. And that's what raised the importance of Mary, Queen of Scots, who then, of course, ended up being judicially murdered eventually, really, essentially.
And it's just sort of quite ironic, really, isn't it, that with Elizabeth, she could have trodden a very different path with Lady Catherine Grey and made the decision, okay, I'm not going to have children of my own, but my cousin, my heir apparent, I mean, we're talking in English law and under the laws of her father's will, Catherine Grey was absolutely the Prince William to King Charles that is Elizabeth. So her sons, Elizabeth could have championed that, but she doesn't. She does the opposite, as you've already said, and throws Catherine in jail, bastardizes her sons. So it's kind of a missed opportunity, but you can also understand kind of where Elizabeth was coming from because, as we know, Catherine did not seek her approval for the marriage.
Yes, and I think she had very bitter memories of Jane Grey. And I also think, although her mother, Elizabeth's mother, Anne Boleyn, was of course not royal, the fact that her own mother was executed must have preyed on her mind. I mean, she must have feared that was a possibility. And after all, in the end, she, although extremely reluctantly, did chop the head off a queen in Mary, Queen of Scots. So it wasn't like it couldn't happen. And so she may have been fearful, bearing in mind that she was only a few years older than Catherine. They were very close together in age. They were both in their 20s when the Queen inherited. No, Catherine was 18 and Elizabeth was 25. But anyway, they were close in age. They're both young women. So Catherine, I'm sure Elizabeth would have been fearful that Edward Seymour, would have wanted to have a crown on his head. And it'd have been lots of, but I'm a man, I'm very important and I have a big penis and you must make me king. And there would have been lots of people around saying, yes, we should have a king. And it's quite outrageous. We have a queen as the head of the Church of England, or governor. They would change the title slightly.
Yeah.
Which is quite wrong and wicked and against the Bible. So I can absolutely, I mean, it was tragic for Catherine, apart from anything else. And possibly tragic for Elizabeth, but I can see why she acted as she did.
And by the stage we get to 1602, has the number of potential successors sort of been whittled down to James and Lord Beauchamp, the eldest son of Lady Catherine Grey, or were there?
No, it was the opposite happened.
Okay.
I think the opposite happened. I think it shattered things into a million pieces. Well, and I think there are accounts which I do quote, which refer to there being at least, I think actually in Harrington's thing, I think there are at least a dozen candidates, many, because they're all so weak, they've all got problems. So you have James, you have Arbella Stuart, you have, as you say, little Lord Beauchamp. You have Philip II's daughter, Isabella, who's a descendant of John of Gaunt, actually senior to the Tudors, which is where her claim came from. Because the Tudors were illegitimate line from John of Gaunt, and Isabella was legitimate line. So, there were quite a few possible candidates.
Yeah. Well, you also had Henry, Earl of Huntingdon kicking around as well, who is the great grandson of Margaret Pole. So a man of strong Plantagenet noble blood as well.
Yes. No, absolutely. And there are other sort of cousins, Stanleys and all sorts of things, some of whom came to sort of sticky ends. Yeah, so nobody knew who it was going to be. That was all. And that actually was just the way Elizabeth wanted it.
Yeah.
Kept them all weak. So as soon as somebody looked, so she would puff up when James was looking too strong, she'd sort of flounce around with Arbella Stuart, sort of patting her on the head and holding her hand or whatever and saying, "Look at marvelous Arbella." And then if Arbella was too strong, Arbella would be sort of shut up with her terrible granny Bess of Hardwick and go quietly mad. So yes.
So to turn our attentions to James a bit, you talk of his court in Scotland as being not only sumptuous, I think we maybe rather condescendingly had this image of the Scottish court being far less refined than the English court, but you also talk about how it was much more relaxed than Elizabeth. So how did that manifest?
Well, in England, we had learnt a lot from the sort of Burgundian court in the 15th century. And so you had some very kind of strict rules and regs, which Elizabeth used, probably needed in a way to use, because, again, being a woman, if she just sort of stomped around slapping people on the back, it just wouldn't have looked it would have made her look weak. She's not one of the boys. So if she becomes this great sort of mystery figure where you have to fall on your knees as she passes by and where you watch her eat at a table almost as if you're watching the mass, almost as if when she takes bread, she's like taking communion and you're watching this sort of divine figure. In Scotland, first of all, you didn't have that same heritage, Burgundian heritage in the same way. And secondly, James is a man, he can afford to be a king and be, I suppose, happy in his own skin in a way, go out hunting with the boys. Well, more than that, frankly, in James's case. But anyway.
Hunting of a sort.
Hunting of a sort, yes. Hunting and other things. He would sit and chat to his mates when he was at table. He was a bit of a drinker, which Elizabeth certainly wasn't. Which I find interesting. It's a part of his personality trait, but he did drink quite heavily. And so it was, the whole atmosphere was a bit more hale and hearty and relaxed.
You mentioned people can sort of come and go into James's presence as they pleased, and obviously that's very removed from the way that Elizabeth was sort of gatekeeped.
That's true. And also, I think the other thing was that James became king when he was just a child.
Yeah.
So it wasn't in a way he grew up in a particular culture and environment. He didn't inherit or create it from another monarch in the same way, which also may have influenced the way things were. It was a very sort of militarized society as well, Scotland. I mean, they were
Mm.
constantly killing each other, in a way they didn't really in England.
In January 1603, Elizabeth journeys from Whitehall Palace to Richmond Palace, what she refers to as her warm box, a journey that would turn out to be her last. Now, based on what you said a moment ago, by this stage, have the councillors all but agreed on James being the successor, or is it still very up in the air?
Yes, I think they have. I mean, there are
Okay.
obviously people who don't agree with it. I mean, like Sir Walter, Sir Walter Raleigh, but certainly, the senior people around Robert Cecil, yeah, they definitely know they definitely who they want. I mean, Cecil is in touch with James. I mean, they're constantly writing to each other. It's all being stitched up behind the scenes, basically.
But even so, it's in these last 2, 3 months of Elizabeth's reign that Lady Arbella Stewart causes quite a lot of drama as well. So what was going on there?
Well, poor Arbella, I think it's partly sort of unfortunate coincidence. I mean, there she was shut up at Hardwick with I said, Granny, Bess. And she was going quietly mad, and she was desperate to get out. She knew that before the death of Essex, that Robert Cecil, for example, had been trying to sort of possibly arrange a marriage with the Earl of Hertford, who's still alive. Catherine Grey was dead, but Edward Seymour, Earl of Hertford, was still alive, with his son, which would have united the Stuart line with the Grey line, and could have been very powerful if they had a child. That would have been very powerful to unite those two royal lines. And so she reached out, hoping that she might be able to arrange that. But she was sort of one woman, one girl really, and a few sort of unlucky servants who were sort of prepared to sort of help her, and she got caught doing it. But it caused a stir. Of course, Elizabeth was very upset. Elizabeth was extremely ill, in fact, dying. And then to have this sort of drama come up now, which she would have remembered from her early reign, her fear of Catherine Grey, her fear of the threat that Catherine posed and Catherine's son posed. And now it's all come back to haunt her in her dying weeks. So you can imagine she was less than thrilled.
Yeah. And on her deathbed, Elizabeth's councillors implore her to give them a sign as to who she selects as her successor.
Or so they say.
So they say. But what do they say happened in this moment?
Well, they say, oh, yes, they went in, and when, they'd sort of give us a list of names, a dozen names or whatever it was. And when they reach James, she sort of makes a sort of circle around her head, or she makes a gesture of some kind that says yes. Or she even says, I think according to one account, she even says, when they mention Beauchamp, she says, I'll have no son of, whatever it was, son of a traitor or son of some bad person as my heir. I can't remember the exact words. But anyway, she definitely is supposed to have appointed or indicated James. But there's no reason, to suppose she did.
It does feel a touch convenient,
It's
doesn't it?
just very, I mean, she might have done, but we don't know. She probably had to be honest, she probably was thinking of more important things like the next life at that stage. And was going to let them get on with it. She wasn't a stupid woman, so she probably knew very well who they wanted.
And I think also you do get the sense with Elizabeth that, as you say, she was sensible. And I think she probably knew in her heart of hearts that James did ultimately have the greatest claim. And also, she's known, as is her mother, as this sort of great feminist icon. Elizabeth is no feminist. She sees herself as somewhat unique. So I think that she would have understood the security that having a male successor provided for a country that she had overseen for over 45 years.
Well, who else would she have chosen, really? That's the thing. Probably wouldn't have chosen Arbella, who wasn't the most robust person. She certainly wouldn't have gone for Isabella in the Netherlands, Philip II's daughter. If it was going to be anyone, I think she probably rather would have gone on living. But yes, I think James is probably would have been her choice when push came to shove,
Yeah.
which it was.
And she dies early on the morning of the 23rd of March, 1603. So what then happens in the immediate aftermath to ensure the crown passes smoothly to James VI?
Oh, it's amazing. You have one of her relations riding to Scotland, carrying a ring, a blue ring, which James had sent to one of Elizabeth's ladies in waiting, and he's bringing it to Scotland to tell James that he is now king. But equally, Robert Cecil and the Privy Council want to tell James officially, and so they're rather angry that Mr. Carey is riding furiously north, and they sort of send horses after him, hoping to get there first. So it's a kind of a race to who gets to tell James first. In fact, it's this chap Carey, but yeah. So he gets to Scotland first and tells James he's king. And of course, James is of course delighted, although he's not absolutely sure that it's really happened until he gets the official message from Cecil and the council.
And that's Robert Carey. He's a grandson of Mary Boleyn, so a first cousin once removed of Elizabeth. And as you say, he takes a ring north, and it's this ring that seeing this ring, James accepts what's happened. It's almost like he's waiting for the final sign off, but this is pretty assured I'm now king.
Yes, exactly. So he's very happy and becomes happier and happier and happier as the days roll until he's almost unhinged with happiness. Yes, so he's very pleased.
As news of Elizabeth's death and James's ascendancy as the new English king begins to make its way across England, how were people responding? I mean, I imagine the response was probably very different between England and Scotland.
Well, the Scots, it depends who you were in Scotland, I think. So Scots felt, I think, two things. I mean, one was they were sad that their king was going to leave Scotland and go to England, and they were losing a king who had been a very effective king of Scotland. So that concerned them. On the other hand, there are a lot of Scots around James who were looking forward to making a packet when they got south of the border and were looking at England, as indeed James was, rubbing their hands with glee, thinking, "Ooh, we're going to get lots of lovely hard cash, hooray!" So there was that going on in Scotland. In England, I think the first reaction was one of intense relief. And James, as he came south, mistook this for sort of genuine joy. But it wasn't genuine joy. It was just, thank God, there's no civil war. Hooray. We're not having some rerun of the Wars of the Roses. We're all going to stay at peace, thank God. So people were very happy about that. They weren't so thrilled that James was a Scot, and even worse, that he was surrounded by Scots. And there were lots of very rude comments about all the Scots. Yes, so there's a lot of sort of xenophobic comment on the Scots. Catholics were almost immediately disappointed because James had been saying to them, yes, I'm going to be really, really, and of course Harrington was amongst those who believed it. Yes, I'm going to be really, really nice to you, and there's going to be no horrible persecution. Because when he arrived in towns, they let out sort of prisoners as part of the celebration. Yes, we'll have pardons, but he wouldn't let out Catholics. So Catholics who were in prison solely because they were refusing to go to Protestant services and therefore had to pay enormous fines, which some of them were too poor to pay, so ended up in prison, where, of course, the result was that their families starved and they caught diseases and died. They were none too, they were obviously already thinking, oh, and the seeds of the gunpowder plot began to be sown. There was an explosion, I think, in London while James was making his way south. This is just from memory, but there was at a gunpowder factory, and one of the Catholics who had supported James, one of the sort of leading Catholics who had supported James and backed James, thought, oh, well, this might be a way of, getting rid of him and getting rid of all the elite who have backed him, which of course turn into the gunpowder plot subsequently. So the Catholics weren't pleased. Puritans were still rather hopeful. They
Yeah.
were thinking, great, he's going to make all these marvelous changes. He's going to reform the Church of England. At long last, we're going to have a proper, thoroughly Calvinist Church of England.
I thought that was what must have been quite difficult for people because, particularly the Catholics, because this is an age before the ability to sort of put out your party manifesto and what you stand for. And I suppose they naively assume he's the son of, the Catholic Mary Queen of Scots. Here's one of our own. And then they get this quite rude awakening when it becomes abundantly clear that he's a Protestant.
Yes, and he had also been fibbing. He had also been deliberately fibbing. I mean, he had, in a sense, put out his manifesto, but like many manifestos, he was economical with the truth. It was designed to be all things to all men. And so yes, so it was a nasty awakening for Catholics, and and of course, in due course, Puritans would also get a not very pleasant awakening, but that would take more time.
And as he travelled south towards London, were there any, to the best of our knowledge, were there any skirmishes or sort of quite fraught moments where he was treated badly by the English?
Well, I think he treated the English quite badly. So they were used to the
Right.
sort of Tudor theatre where the Queen and indeed her predecessors Mary and Henry would give speeches saying how much they loved the people, and the people would say be sort of loving back, and they had this kind of relationship. Whereas James felt no, the ordinary people should be squished underfoot, and didn't want to go anywhere near them, and it was certainly not friendly. And not much later, a few years later, notoriously pulled down his breeches and threatened to show them his arse. Which is rather, you can't imagine the late Queen having done either first or second. But anyway, so so they were a bit disappointed. They were also a bit disappointed because at one point there was a pickpocket who was arrested, and as far as I recall, and James just said he should had him hanged without trial, and I think that also appalled people. So yes, I don't know if James behaved particularly well. I think there was a priest, I think, who may have accosted him at one point, but I don't think it was anything particularly terrible.
I see, okay. And as he takes up his position as King of England, did the court take on more of a Scottish feel in the way they operated, or did James try to assimilate into English court tradition?
Well, he put on a pearl earring, I think, and he'd always disapproved of those. I think well, it depended on your perspective, really. But I think if you were English, you'd have said it became far too Scottish, and he remained surrounded by Scots. And Scots were his gatekeepers. A lot of Scots became very rich and very powerful. James tried to sort of improve matters by marrying Scots aristocrats to English aristocrats. A project which I may say, lasted down the centuries. So the high aristocracy in England and Scotland remain intermarried to this day, and continue to intermarry, of course. But it took on he did start dressing a bit better, but there was also it also became much more relaxed, particularly where drink was concerned. So, as I mentioned, James liked to drink. Elizabeth didn't drink. And then now you had people, getting incredibly, having sort of parties and people getting incredibly pissed and falling over and misbehaving, both girls and boys, which not everyone approved of. So there was a certain amount of that. And in fact, I think that first winter, first Christmas, one thing all the horrified people is Annie, his wife, Queen Anne. she had all Elizabeth's clothes, not all Elizabeth's, she had some of Elizabeth's sort of clothes, which were all magnificent and beautifully embroidered and jeweled and, were actual state treasures. She had them chopped off at the sort of calf, and then appeared in masks dancing around in them. So
It became like a fancy dress.
yeah, it's fancy dress, exactly. Can you imagine? You had these state costumes which were considered state treasure, and you had them sort of treated as a sort of fancy dress costume, chopped up.
It must have felt extremely strange for the native English. I mean, it must have felt like maybe a less dramatic William the Conqueror coming in, and the Anglo-Saxon population suddenly have to just accept this new reality. I think this would have felt not a million miles away.
I think the huge difference was there aren't that many Scots. And so you didn't have Scots running the whole of England. You really didn't. You had Scots at court, which was incredibly annoying if you were an English courtier or an English aristocrat. But essentially, there aren't that many of them. And they didn't bring lots of Scots with them. I mean, so it was just a few Scottish toffs, basically. Quite enough to be annoying to the English, but nevertheless not so many as to oppress the English people. I do often think, though, when the Scots sort of, say, "Oh my God, for us, breaking away, we must sort of have our own nation or whatever." But I think, but our monarchy is descended from the Stuarts. It's the poor English.
I know.
Squish.
I know that I've always found that sort of ironic that it's actually the crown being united was united under a Scottish king.
Yeah, and who was before? Welsh, the Tudors. Welsh, no right to the English throne. These Welsh interlopers, they're the Scots.
You mention on a few occasions in the book that James may have suffered with ADHD. So
yeah.
What were the things that you sort of hone in on that make you consider that as a possible part of his character?
Well, I wondered that at times. When I wrote this book, which was like quarter of a century ago now, it does seem ridiculous anything could be so long ago. But it belonged to 20 years ago anyway. ADHD, not much was known about ADHD, and I'm certainly as ignorant as anyone, unfortunately. But there were things that struck me at the time. He reminded me of people I know, and that made me think of it. So he was always physically always moving. People said he was like a man standing on an ant heap. So physically he was always mobile, always moving, twitching, moving, wriggling. He was never still. He was physically incredibly energetic. He obviously found hunting a great release. On a horse all day. It's very physical. It's tremendously exciting. There was one thing that people with ADHD dislike. It's being bored. And they're easily bored. And James was easily bored. But there's a misunderstanding about ADHD, which I luckily didn't misunderstand at the time, which was that people think that because people with ADHD get bored easily, and who can blame them, frankly. I mean, I suspect it runs in my family, to be honest. They focus very intensely on what interests them. So I remember Andrew Roberts, I think it was, who reviewed my book and reviewed it very positively, except he said, "Oh, ADHD, surely not, you wrote all these books." And what Andrew didn't understand is that people with ADHD do focus very intensely on what interests them, and have tremendous razor focus. And this is what James had. He wasn't so focused on things like money and saving money and things like that. He wasn't very good at that kind of thing. It bored him, frankly. But things that interested him, like theology, he could focus on, and he wrote these tremendous treatises on the divine right of kings and all sorts of things.
So on the 25th of July, 1603, James and his wife, Queen Anna, are crowned in Westminster Abbey. This is a first. It's the first king and queen to be crowned of both England and Scotland previously. So with this in mind, were there any major changes made to the coronation?
Yes, there were changes made because it was the first properly Protestant coronation. Because you had Edward, you would think you had Edward VI, but in fact that was very soon after Henry VIII had died, and Henry VIII was not a Protestant. Exactly, Henry VIII was not a Protestant, and so it was not a Protestant service. I mean, they definitely made changes, but they couldn't make all the changes they wanted. They didn't want to. The English people were not Protestant and would have been aghast. And in fact, there was a massive rebellion when they got rid of the mass later in Edward VI's reign. And similarly, when Elizabeth became queen, Mary Tudor had just died. And again, Elizabeth was anxious not to make the changes too obvious, and she received communion behind a screen. Again, that's one of the things I found sort of interesting watching how that was actually handled. It's not clear exactly how that was handled as Elizabeth's coronation. But with James, heir to a Protestant queen, a Protestant king, you could have a Protestant service. I mean, what was interesting was, of course, is that the whole ceremony is a medieval Catholic ceremony. So quite difficult to keep the ceremony and the pageantry and the whole thing and not keep it Catholic. So it disappointed Puritans, you might say, because it was still, you can't really strip all the Catholicism out of a coronation ceremony. It's too ingrained, interwoven in it, really. But certainly, there was no mass.
Because the coronation, it's such a crucial part of also conveying that majesty and the divine. So if you strip it back too much to it being, sort of black and white, it loses part of its magic, I suppose, as well, doesn't it?
I know. I sort of worry slightly about what Prince William's going to do, because
I agree.
I mean,
when I heard him saying royal with a little R, I go,
and what's the point? What's the point?
Exactly.
There's a huge mistake, and in fact, far from, I think, Charles III's coronation being too over the top. I think it wasn't done well enough.
But I was really hoping as well that, because a coronation is a unique opportunity, I was really hoping that we'd see the royal princes and princesses, the royal dukes, all in proper ceremonial dress robe, with if we look back at the coronation of Elizabeth II, you had the Queen Mother, you had Princess Margaret, the other princesses of the blood, all wearing coronets, and I wanted that.
I agree, actually. And it was all very sort of cutesy, saying that they weren't going to have all these dukes and duchesses and they were going to have the sort of Queen's grandchildren or whatever. And I wanted to say, look, it's not about you. It's not about you and your lovely grandchildren. It's about it's about the monarch representing the nation. And this is a part of what it is. And you're only there, in the case of the king, by birth, and as the queen from marriage. And it's not about, and you need to remember, it's not about you. So it's not actually so humble to have your grandchildren. It's the opposite. It's quite narcissistic, is my probably a very unpopular view. But
no, I definitely understand what you mean. I think the stripping away of the fact that the nobility was so truncated down, I think, was a real shame. But it's one of those things. We'll have to see what happens with William.
Exactly. Also, it's nice to watch. It's not that we all want to go touching our caps to the Duke of Norfolk or whatever. I'm sure we don't. But equally, we'll want some of the magic. I think one of the reasons what we don't want to do as well is be touching our caps to politicians. I mean, can you imagine?
And so my final question for you really is that I think maybe we say this with hindsight, but we tend to view James as a sort of effeminate, largely ineffective monarch. Based on your writing, though, I assume you think he's sort of quite grossly underrated.
Oh, yes. No, he is grossly underrated. I mean, to be a homosexual is not to be effeminate, if effeminate is taken to mean weak or indeed feminine. I wouldn't describe it. I don't think there's anything wrong with being feminine, personally, but I don't think he was feminine, and I certainly don't think he was ineffectual. No, he was probably the greatest ever king of Scotland. He was a very great king of Scotland. He was less successful as a king of England. He didn't understand the English why would he? He was essentially a foreigner, an outsider. But he but he was a highly intelligent man. He managed the kingdom relatively successfully for the length of his reign. There's certainly been many more disastrous English kings of England than James, the Scottish King of England. Frankly, look at Henry VI, for example. My God, or indeed his son Charles I. So yes, no, there's a lot to be said for James. He was a remarkable man, and one of the things I respect about him as well, which you say the same about Elizabeth. They're both flawed human beings, as we all are, indeed, but he was resilient. He was a tough bastard, actually. I mean, when you think the way he grew up, I mean, you're watching sort of people being murdered in front of him when he was 5 years old, or shot in front of him, people killed all around him, being kidnapped. I mean, he had a terrifying childhood and adulthood, indeed. And yet, people sort of think of him as a sort of coward. I don't think he was a coward at all. He was extraordinarily brave and resilient. He had good reason to worry about being murdered. People did try and murder him on more than one occasion. I mean, he was just good sense, frankly.
Well, thank you very much for coming back on the podcast. This has been really fun, and I knew it would be because it's such a fascinating window of English history that just doesn't get enough attention, I think. So are you working on anything new at the moment in the world of history, or what are you up to at the moment?
I am. I'm writing a book on Thomas Wolsey. Which I'm really enjoying, actually, I must say. And actually, unusually, I'm going to actually hand my homework in on time, which is sort of next spring. So it may not be too many thousand years before it comes out.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much again for coming on the podcast. And hopefully then we'll speak maybe at some point next year when you've got a book out about Thomas Wolsey.
Thank you very much.
That brings us to the end of this week's episode of the Tudor Chest podcast. My thanks to Leanda for coming back onto the show, and my thanks to you, the listener, for tuning in. Next week, I'm going out of the world of the 15th and 16th century and going back several hundred years to the 12th century as I speak to Catherine Hanley, all about one of the most fascinating women in all of English history, in my opinion, the Empress Matilda, the first woman in English history who should have been Queen Regnant, but was of course famously pipped to the post by her cousin, King Stephen. Join me next Thursday to hear all about this remarkable woman's story. Thank you again for listening to the Tudor Chess podcast, and chat to you next week.